At 8 o'clock on the morning of December 1st, 1945, an American firing squad stood in position at Aversa, near Naples. The prisoner waiting for them was not a camp guard, not a clerk, not one more forgotten official dragged from the ruins of the Third Reich. He was General Anton Dostler, a senior German officer, a man with decades in uniform behind him, a Knight's Cross holder, a commander who had once carried the full authority of the Wehrmacht. In a few moments, that authority would mean nothing. He was tied to a wooden stake in the cold Italian air. An officer stepped forward and read the sentence. Dostler listened without speaking. Then the rifles came up. The shots that killed him were punishment for an order he had passed down more than a year earlier. An order that sent 15 captured American servicemen to their deaths. Not in battle, not while trying to escape. After capture, after disarmament, after there was still time to choose something else. That is the real story, not a rumor, not one of those war stories that gets cleaner and more dramatic every time it's retold. This one has names, dates, orders, objections, graves, and photographs. And at the center of it is a question that still makes people uneasy now, just as it did then. What happens when a general says he was only following orders? To understand why Anton Dostler ended up at that stake, you have to go back to Italy in the spring of 1944. The war there had slowed into something stubborn and costly. Allied armies were fighting their way north, but the German defense had not broken. The Italian campaign was not the fast collapse many had imagined. It had turned into a hard, grinding struggle of mountains, railways, supply lines, and narrow opportunities. Every tunnel mattered. Every bridge mattered. Every mile of track mattered. If you could break the line behind German positions, you could ease pressure at the front. That was the thinking behind Operation Ginny II. The mission was dangerous from the beginning. 15 American servicemen, attached to the Office of Strategic Services, and drawn from the 2677th Headquarters Company, Detachment C, were sent toward the Ligurian coast. Many of them were Italian-American. That was one reason they had been chosen. If everything worked, they would move more easily through the region, speak the language, blend better than other troops might have, and strike a vital rail tunnel between Genoa and La Spezia. It was the kind of mission that looked precise on a map and felt nearly impossible once real men had to carry it out in darkness, under pressure, on a hostile shore. They came ashore near Punta Bianca in March 1944. The plan was simple enough: land quietly, move inland, destroy the tunnel, disrupt German transport, then get out. But war has a way of punishing plans that look neat on paper. Something went wrong almost immediately. Their movement was noticed. The coast was too exposed. The timing was off. Local attention turned into alarm, and alarm turned into pursuit. Before the team could strike its target, German and fascist forces closed in. The 15 Americans were captured on March 24, 1944. And that is where this stopped being a failed raid and became something darker, because once those men were prisoners, the law should have been clear. They were uniformed American soldiers. They were not saboteurs in disguise. They were not spies pretending to be civilians. They had landed in enemy territory for a military mission, but they had done so in uniform, which meant they were entitled to treatment as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Interrogate them, move them, hold them until the war ends. That was the legal path. Instead, another path opened. Back in 1942, Hitler had issued what became known as the Commando Order. It was one of the bluntest criminal directives of the war. It called for Allied commandos to be killed even if they were captured in uniform. It did not matter whether they had surrendered. It did not matter whether they could be lawfully classified as prisoners of war. The point of the order was to erase the protections that civilized armies were supposed to honor. When the 15 captured Americans were handed into the German chain of command in Italy, officers below Dostler recognized the danger immediately. They objected. They pointed out that the prisoners were in uniform. They understood that killing them would violate the laws of war. That detail matters because it means this was not some split-second battlefield panic. It was not confusion. It was not chaos. Men inside the system understood the order was illegal before it was carried out. Anton Dostler was the commander who moved the order forward anyway. Maybe that is one reason the story still lands so hard. He was not a madman in a trench. He was not some faceless executioner at the edge of a pit. He was a professional officer, exactly the kind of man who later claimed duty, discipline, and command necessity. He belonged to the respectable surface of the German war machine, and that surface, again and again, concealed crimes carried out in a tone of procedure. On March 26, 1944, the 15 Americans were taken out and shot near La Spezia. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave. That is the sentence at the center of this story. They were taken out and shot. 15 young Americans who had landed believing they still had a mission to complete. 15 men who should have been alive in a prison camp. 15 men who instead disappeared into the machinery of an illegal order. Back in the United States, most families would have known only that something had gone wrong. That was how war worked. A son was missing. A telegram came late. Details were uncertain. The newspapers carried the big arrows of the campaign, the advance up Italy, the endless attention on France, on the Pacific, on names the public already knew. But the smaller tragedies often stayed small. Unless a family kept the memory alive, unless a document survived, unless a trial forced the facts into the open, men could vanish from the national story almost entirely. That nearly happened here, but not completely. After the liberation of Italy, Allied investigators began to trace what had happened to the missing Americans. Evidence emerged. Witnesses spoke. Orders were found. The burial site was identified. The command trail led upward, and it led directly to General Anton Dostler. By the fall of 1945, he was facing an American military commission in Italy. His defense was the one history keeps hearing in every generation. He said the order had not truly been his. Hitler had issued the Commando Order. Higher authority had confirmed the prisoners were to be shot. He had acted within a system that left no room for refusal. It is the sort of argument that can sound persuasive if you imagine military command as a chain so rigid that moral judgment disappears the moment an order comes from above. But the commission did not accept that. The judges looked at the facts. The Americans had been captured in uniform. That alone was crucial. Subordinates had already raised objections, which meant Dostler knew there was a legal problem. He was not blindly transmitting something he didn't understand. He had been warned. He had a choice. He passed the order on anyway. That made the case larger than one dead general and 15 murdered prisoners. Because if the defense had worked, then almost every war criminal in Europe could point upward and claim innocence. The man who signed would blame the man who dictated. The man who dictated would blame the man above him. And in the end, guilt would vanish into the clouds, leaving only dead victims and nobody responsible except a handful of leaders at the very top. The American tribunal refused that logic. Dostler was convicted and sentenced to death. Contemporary coverage understood the importance right away. This was not just a punishment. It was an answer. One of the earliest and clearest Allied statements that superior orders did not automatically excuse a war crime. That is why the photographs from Aversa matter. People often see those images without knowing the names behind them. They remember the German general tied to a stake, the officer reading the order, the firing squad, the moment his body falls. The picture is famous because it is stark and final. But if all you remember is the execution photo, then you are remembering the wrong man first. The real center of the story is not Anton Dostler's death. It is the 15 Americans who never got a trial, never got a defense lawyer, never got to say one word in their own favor before rifles were aimed at them. Dostler did get that chance. That difference is the whole moral weight of the case. He had counsel. He had a hearing. He had time to explain himself. The men he condemned had none of that, and maybe that is why the story still feels modern. Because the central issue has never gone away. Every serious military, including America's, depends on obedience. Orders matter. Discipline matters. Chains of command matter. But there has to be a line beyond which a person cannot hide behind rank or procedure. There has to be a point where the law says, no, you still knew what this was. In the Dostler case, that line was drawn clearly. The prisoners were in uniform. The order was illegal. The commander knew. The men died anyway. And so, on December 1, 1945, at Aversa, the judgment came back to him. By then the war had been over in Europe for months. Americans were already trying to return to normal life. Men were coming home. Families were rebuilding. The country was looking ahead. But some unfinished business remained, and part of that business was deciding whether the crimes of the war would be treated as crimes at all. Anton Dostler's execution was one answer to that question, not the largest answer, not the only one, but one of the clearest. The firing squad that morning did more than end one man's life. It announced that a uniform could not erase responsibility, that a general could not make murder lawful just by putting it into official language, that dead prisoners still counted, that the chain of command had limits, and behind all of it, always, were the 15 men from Operation Ginny II. They had crossed the water, believing they were part of something precise and necessary. They were trying to strike a tunnel, delay a railway, help a campaign that had stalled in the mountains of Italy. Instead, they became victims of an order that should never have been obeyed. Today, there is a memorial at the site where they were executed. That matters, because memory needs a place to stand. Otherwise, the famous photograph takes over, and the story gets reduced to one fallen general, one dramatic morning, one last command. But the truth is larger and sadder. This was never just the story of a German general at a stake. It was the story of 15 American prisoners who should have lived. And it was the story of what happened when one officer decided that an illegal order was still an order worth carrying out.